welcome everybody. While everyone's joining, I'll just give a little bit of background before turning it on over to Jen. So welcome into the awesome 2021. We are so excited. I am Liz Lembke. I am one of the co-instigators from the L&D Cares side, together with John Hinchliffe and the GLDC, which is the Global Learning and Development Community. Hi from Stockholm, Sweden. Awesome, exactly. Where are you guys dialing in from? Wonderful. So the Welcome into the Awesome, this is going to be on the 25th and 26th, and a lot of you are have been chewing your fingernails, but also getting really excited as you think about what you're going to be sharing in your talk. And so that's why we are so excited to have both Greg and Dale here together with us today to help prep and set you up for success. So with that, I turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Jennifer.
Thanks, Liz. And I am just really excited. Giddy might be the word I would use, to be able to share these really good friends, Dale, Ludwig, and Greg Owen-Boger, with all of you today. So Greg and I met several years ago at an ATD conference I think we were in Florida.
That sounds right, but who knows? They add up after a while, right?
It's always in Florida.
Yeah. So we met at a chapter leaders session at the conference, and I just happened to sit down at the table with Greg and some other folks that I knew, and we struck up several conversations, and it was just really, really wonderful to make that connection and start this wonderful relationship with Greg and with Dale, who have a wonderful organization called Turpin Communications, and I'm going to let them share a little bit about that, but I'm just so excited that you all get to experience them today, and you are going to leave here with so much wonderful information. So with that, I'll just turn things over to you, Greg.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction. And I do remember that moment of us meeting. That connection was so strong right at the very beginning. So that's one of the benefits of being at conferences, right? Those relationships that you make. And you can't put a price tag on that at all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that we can get started. Let me know when you see my screen.
Yep.
Got it. We got it.
All right. Well, everybody, congratulations. You've been selected to speak. The question is, now what, right? So Dale and I are here to help you through, give you some pointers on things that we've learned over the years, because we've been talking at conferences for a super long time. So before we get into that, though, I want to give you a little bit of background about the work that we do. We are communication consultants and trainers, and we work with 3 different types of communicators: presenters, meeting facilitators, and trainers. And Dale founded Turpin Communication 29 years ago, and I'm 26 years in. So when you do one thing for a really long time, you tend to write books about it. And so we're going to talk about the orderly conversation here in a little bit. But we also have a book called Effective SMEs. And when the pandemic hit, we'd always wanted to write a companion piece to our original book, The Orderly Conversation. So we had a little bit of time on our hands. So we wrote the virtual Orderly Conversation. We're going to give you a link to a free download of that book a little bit later. So our vision at Turpin Communication is a future where meetings, presentations, and training sessions are the least frustrating parts of doing business. And wouldn't that be great? So our goal then for you is to set you up for success. But for each of you, that's going to mean something slightly different. So let's define what success is going to look like. I am going to put into chat how I want to be described. I'll give you an example of what we're looking for here. And copy paste. When I think about how I want to be described, I want to be described as trustworthy, expert, creative, a thought leader, someone they want to work with, likable, friendly, and their go-to guy. So take a minute and think about this question for you. How would you finish this sentence? Just go ahead and drop some ideas into chat. You can steal from me. You can come up with words of your own. It doesn't matter. What we're doing, though, is we're starting to define what a successful conference presentation will feel like to you and the people that you're talking with. John says memorable. Yes, that's great. And Sandy says inspiring. David says the same. Plus friendly, funny, intelligent, helpful. Doug says engaging, comfortable, creative, energetic. I apologize if I butcher your name. I believe it's Arini. Says authentic, creative knowledge on my subject, knowledgeable of my subject matter and engaging. Innovative, wise, competent, makes me feel comfortable. Exactly. So for those of you who said funny, that leads you down a certain path when you are creating your content and when you are delivering it, right? And then that leads to creating your professional brand. So my professional brand is one thing, Dale's is another, Liz has one, Jennifer has one. We all have a brand, and we want to be thoughtful about how we express that brand when we're at conferences. And it's just a quick poll. We want to give an idea for us. Are you an external consultant, an internal employee, or other? And if you go to the polls tab, you'll be able to answer that question. And Liz, I'm realizing we didn't talk about what the poll results look like, so I'll let you share that with us.
I love it. Yes, absolutely. So we have 15 votes in. We have a couple more votes. We're 23 in the room. So this is nice because it helps us out. So we have a couple more votes now.
Come on, let's get to 100%. People, let's do this.
Exactly. I love it. Okay, so we have, wow, this is interesting. We have external consultants, internal employees, pretty much head to head, and then one other, okay, to describe in the chat. Now we're all curious, okay? Both, I love it.
Yeah.
All right, we need both internal consultant. Okay, professional voiceover talent. I love it. Okay.
All right. Very good. Well, let's get at it, shall we? Drop your session title into chat for us. We're curious about what you're going to be talking about and how creative and compelling you are with your title. Oh, I see I have to scroll to be able to see. Got it. Okay. Making content that's that's fire without burning out. Okay. Don't label me. I'm not for sale. That's creative. Deciphering a learning mindset. High Five Friday. Is doing what you should, blocking your success. Oh boy. Being idiotic. Okay. There's some creative titles here. The reason I wanted to ask you about your titles is because one of your jobs as a speaker is to get people into your room, right? So you have to be creative with your title. So it looks like you're doing a good job there. So now the last question I'm going to ask you is about nervousness. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you don't experience any nerves at all, and 10 being severe nerves, where would you say you put yourself on that continuum when the nervousness strikes, if it strikes at all? See, we've got a 6, an 8, 4, an 8, 3 or 4, 5, 8. Okay. So for most of you, it's a mid-range degree of nervousness. We're going to be talking a little bit how to deal with those nerves. And, you know, we all experience nervousness in different ways. And what we need to do is just find a way to get our brains focused and get some breath into our lungs, right? So that will help calm us down. It's easier said than done, though, when the juices are really, really flowing. All right. So we're going to answer 4 big questions and more. These 4 questions were in our session description. The first one is, how do you give attendees what they need when you don't know their experience or the background? Here's a quick answer. Ask. We just did. So if you don't exactly know what people's experience level is, one of the things you'll want to build into your session is to ask them. The next question is, how do you make a presentation not sound like a sales pitch? The answer is very carefully. You have to be careful, especially consultants. When presenting virtually, how do you engage attendees through the lens of a camera? Well, our quick answer to that is just observe us and stick around. We're going to be talking about the mechanics of that. And then finally, how are you supposed to pare down years of experience or expertise into a bite-sized session? Stick around. We'll be talking about that as well. So here's our agenda for the next 45 minutes. We're going to talk about getting the gig. Now, I recognize that you've already got the gig, but hopefully you'll be getting more. So we'll give you a couple best practices for that. Then we're going to talk about engaging in an orderly conversation. Then we'll talk about framing the conversation, imagery and storytelling, virtual tools and interactivity, delivering slides virtually, and finally, time allowing, we will open it up for Q&A. That does not mean, though, that you should hold your questions to the end. If you have a question or a comment, please, we encourage you to drop them into either the chat or the Q&A piece, and either Liz or Jennifer will interrupt us. So let's talk about getting the gig. Here you have an image of a YouTube video where Julie Growens from Training Magazine interviewed me. What was she interviewing me on? It's an article that I wrote after walking out of far too many presentations at conferences. I was so frustrated because people were overselling, under-delivering. We weren't getting what was being, I wasn't getting what was expected, right? And I finally walked out of this one where this leadership development consultant had us stand up and pair up and turn around from each other and take off jewelry and take off sweaters and whatever, change our appearance. And then we had to guess what the changes were. And we did this for like 10 or 15 minutes. And so this consultant wrapped this activity up by saying, see, change is hard. And you know what? She took 10, 15 minutes to do that. She could have said to a room of L&D folks, change is hard, and we would have all been on the same page with her. So I was so frustrated with this. I wrote this article, and Julie interviewed me about it. And we'll give you a link to this interview if you are interested. I bring this up, though, because it is an honor to speak at a conference. It's an honor for Dale and me to be here. And when you treat something with that amount of importance and gravity, it allows you to expand your thought leadership. You grow your professional brand, you build your business, and ultimately give back to the community. So try to put your brain in that mindset that it is an honor to be speaking at the conference. And then, of course, a compelling title, as we've already mentioned, and then don't oversell in your description. You want to be able to deliver against what you promise. So we asked the question, how do you pare down a lifetime of work? Well, you need to put things in one or two categories. Is this nice to have? Champagne's nice to have, but do you really need it? And when it comes to paring down your information, you really have to figure out, what do people need? Now, if you can sprinkle in some champagne, that's great, but stick with the water at first. And that brings us to engaging in an orderly conversation. And Dale, I'm going to let you take over from here.
All righty. Let me see if I can share my screen successfully. So far, so good.
The struggle is real. Every time we work in a new platform.
Especially for me. So
there we go. We're seeing it.
Can you see it? All right, great. All right, I'm going to talk a bit about engaging in an orderly conversation. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is exactly what kind of communication are we involved in business, and especially at conferences? What needs to happen? How do we define it? And I'm going to use this continuum to do that. We have a continuum between very casual conversations on the left, and then we have very formal speeches on the right. And of course, the differences among these two things and meetings and presentations is the level of preparation, type of preparation that goes into it, and what it actually feels like once that interaction begins. Now, the conversation is very comfortable, not very planned, and very informal, whereas a speech is much more formal and much more planned. So the work you're doing at a conference is somewhere between a speech and a presentation. And that is because especially a virtual conference, you're speaking to a fairly large group of people. You need to have a plan. There are usually very strict time limits on it. So you've really got to be buttoned up. But at the same time, it is also a presentation in that you are taking a step toward a more conversational sort of type of communication, whereas one that is not scripted, one that is not planned to the absolute bottom line of the last period of the last sentence. It's got to be delivered in a more flexible fashion. So what it should feel like to you and to the people that you're talking to at the conference is a conversation. So the question is, how do you manage that? Because you've got very strict structural needs, but on the other hand, you need to be more spontaneous and interactive. And that's kind of what the first book was all about, because we found that business presenters tended to be confused or to overthink the process to the point where they lost the conversation. And so we wrote the book called The Orderly Conversation, Business Presentations Redefined, as a way to sort of start at the beginning again and say, all right, what type of interaction, what type of communication is taking place? And the image we used to talk about it is this one, where we have orderly on the left, you got conversation on the right, and an arrow between the two representing a pretty big tension between those two things. So on the orderly side, of course, you need to be prepared. There needs to be accuracy. You got to think about what you're going to talk about, and you need some structure. Not only do you need structure, but the people listening to you also need structure. So the orderly part of it is really important. On the other hand, so is the conversation. You need to be engaged, spontaneous, interactive. All of that conversational give and take needs to be at least possible in the presentation that you're delivering. Because even with Greg saying a minute ago, interrupt us whenever you want, that's one way to make sure the conversation is going to happen so that you don't turn into a scripted presenter, which is not what you do not want to do, especially at a conference. So that's the tension involved here. What it means in a real practical way is that presenters succeed on two levels. And the first level on the left, you want to achieve your goal. So you want the people walking away from your conference presentation having learned something. If I start from the bottom, at work, you might want to get people to align, get people to agree, or get people to buy what you're selling. So all of it is about having a very specific practical goal. Now you reach that goal through the conversation, through the second process, the second level of success. And that was all about managing the conversation.
And Dale,
yes.
We have our first opportunity to kind of interrupt, and
Great.
Greg told me before we came on stage, he said we enjoy was the word he used, being interrupted. So we do have a question from Arini. Again, apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Interactivity might be tough for me because I get caught up in the presentation and may not pay attention to the chat. So what advice do you have to overcome that?
Oh, that happens all the time to me. So I understand that. What we do is always have someone watching the chat for us. Now, is that going to be happening at the conference? Is someone going to be on top of the chat, or are the speakers responsible for it?
I am sure that there will always be a host, and I think Liz is jumping in to join that conversation quickly. We always have a host that is in the room and can do in air meet what we're doing today. So that will probably be helpful. But Liz, what else do you want to add? Still no.
Well,
while see how that works
while Liz is figuring out her audio, I would say that we are modeling right now what should be done, right? You have our back as the host, and you interrupted us. We're dealing with the question. It's a conversation, and then at some point, Dale will need to grab the reins back and move forward, right?
Right. And when you don't have someone backing you up, when you don't have a host or a producer, you've got to make it a conscious choice to stop and check the chat. And which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to work virtually, because there are so many things you have to monitor. And one of them is the chat. What I do when when we're delivering training, it's always to a fairly small group of people. And we always say, speak up, please speak up, because I don't want to miss anything that you have to say. So go off mute, interrupt me. I don't care. Just jump right in. And Greg,
I just wanted to
that
add,
intake seems to mean that you have to.
You know me well. It's let people know what you're doing, because it might feel like an awkward silence if you do this. But if you just say, I'm just going to take a moment to look at chat. Oh, okay, great. Then move on. And so that awkward silence doesn't feel so awkward because they know what you're doing.
Right. It's like, I always think of it as narrating my activity. If I'm using a second monitor, which I'm not today, but if I am, it's over here to my left. So that means I need to say, let me check over here. Okay, back. So, and Greg does that all the time as well, because he keeps the videos of learners on his second monitor. So when he wants to see them, he has to turn this way. But as long as people know what you're doing in a virtual situation, they will be fine with it. But that is an excellent question. Thank you for it. But let's get back to this slide. All right, so You won't reach first level without the second level. You must be able to create the conditions for a fruitful discussion. You've got to earn trust and goodwill, make it easy for folks, manage the give and take that takes place, and nurture relationships. Now, a couple of these, earning trust and goodwill and nurturing relationships, are things that occur usually over time, but they're also important in a one-time conference presentation, because you want to be the kind of presenter that, as you said in your list of goals, is approachable, seems to like people, is open to questions. All of those things build trust and goodwill going forward. And the fact that you are going to do your best to adapt to their particular needs, find out who they are, what they need out of your session, all of that also helps build trust. But the other thing I want to point out, which will be coming up later in this presentation, is you want to make it easy for folks. It's your responsibility to make sure that they find listening to you and understanding what you're saying easy. And that involves slides, your delivery, the whole thing. So 2 levels of success: the plan and the process. Let's go on here. So if we're in a conversation, we have to be engaged in it. That's a fairly simple idea, but when we use that term, we define it as being able to think on your feet, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. So when we think about this in a face-to-face environment and virtually, but it's different face-to-face, and I'll get to that. When you're engaged, you are here and now. You're in the moment, not anticipating, not judging. You're right here with us. You're self-aware and in control. You're not self-conscious, but you are self-aware of what you're doing. You're feeling comfortable. You know instinctively what to do and say, just like a regular conversation. That's important because you got to trust your conversational skills in a more formal setting. And all of that is very difficult to do in a virtual environment. So what it means is the 2 primary skills that you use for engagement face-to-face, pausing and breathing to think, and eye contact to connect and observe people, get changed. And of course, as you all know, the change is eye contact is not mutual in a virtual environment until we get the technology that allows us to see people when we're looking into the camera. It will always be that way. So you need to think about how to get engaged and stay on track without the benefit of direct eye contact as you're speaking. So engaging the camera. This is probably the most difficult thing, and you've all been living with it for over a year now. But engaging the camera means that to connect the attendees, you need to look into the camera when you're speaking and when you're listening. Now, there are times when you won't. We already mentioned, checking over here or looking down here. But generally speaking, you want to look into the camera as you're speaking and when you're listening. And that is completely counterintuitive, because what you want to do, of course, is look at the videos of the people that are speaking to you. So look at the camera. Check in to observe others' videos from time to time. Greg uses a driving metaphor for this. The camera is the windshield in your car, and the videos or the slides or whatever else you need to look at are the side view and the rear view mirrors. You need to see what's happening around you. So let that happen, but let the primary focus be your eye contact goes into the camera. And nod when listening, which is best practice when you're face-to-face too, but it does make you look like you're really listening, because people, and you know this as well, but the video's small. All we're seeing is part of you, your face, and maybe your hands if they're in the frame. So you want to give as many visual cues, you want to move as much as you can to keep people focused. And also be a role model for others. This is especially important when you're delivering training. So what that means, and this is a big point, is you got to focus on how you're perceived, not on how it feels. That's the big hurdle everybody had to get over when we went virtual. But it's true. You need to think about what are they seeing? How am I setting the tone for this conference, for this presentation? Not on how it feels, because it feels awkward looking into the camera, and it still does for me. It's getting better. Maybe after a year, I'm finally getting used to directing a lot of attention to a camera. I can more easily imagine all of you sitting out there as I look at the camera, but it's not intuitive and it takes a lot of work. So focus on that. Focus on how you are coming across rather than how it feels to you. When we get back to face-to-face, it's all about how it feels to you, because engagement feels good. When you really are looking at people and they're responding to you, that's a good, positive thing. But until we get there, we got to think about how we're perceived. Just a minor point here that's important for your conference stuff. Well, it's not minor. Probably everybody's pretty good at it by now. But camera placement requires thinking about the rule of thirds. Get your eyes into the upper third or at the line of the upper third as this guy is here. That's going to just make you look more professional, give people a better shot of how you're coming across. You just adjust your camera, figure out how whatever your setup is, adjust it so that we can get a nice, even good straight on shot of you. And let me talk a little bit about being engaged versus being engaging. Being engaged, as I said before, is about being in the moment and being able to think on your feet. Being engaging is about being interesting enough, as it says here, so that people will be willing to listen to you. And that's where the work comes in the virtual environment, especially.
So another question as you transition, Dale, that we have is, what would you say is the biggest difference between training via video and speaking at a conference via video, like these speakers will be doing in
right. It's going to feel much more formal to you when you're speaking at a conference, and you really, really have to do enough dry runs, which means not practicing to be perfect, but talking through your presentation enough so that you know how long it takes. And it's about anticipating questions that people may have. For me, a conference presentation is not the most comfortable way to speak because the audiences are much larger than I'm used to. And I just feel like I don't know enough about them to adapt. But I have to get over that and realize that I'm the primary driver of a conference presentation. And any interaction I get with people is just a bonus on top of that. But it's got to be, I cannot rely on, well, we'll talk about that once we get started, as I would if I were training. And I have to have it ready to go. Much more than I would naturally want to do it. Greg, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll add that while we're working in AirMeet, Dale and I can only see each other, and Jen and Liz when they come onto the stage with us. In a training session, you're typically going to be able to see almost everybody, right? And so there's even less of that human connection in a conference in this particular setup, which makes it less comfortable for most people because we get our comfort from making that eye contact with people and that connection with people. Right. So as Dale's previous slide says, you have to work to be engaged and engaging, and which is about simulating the conversational tone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Good question. And that relates to the slide. You got to work as hard as you do face-to-face. This was my breakthrough moment during the pandemic. I had to think about vocal energy, facial expression, posture, gestures, just as I would in a face-to-face environment. And when I transferred those skills and that level of energy to the camera, then I felt comfortable because I really don't like being on video. I do not like seeing myself on video. It is never going to be comfortable for me. I'm pretty convinced of that now, but it's getting better. And the reason it got better was because of this. I got into the mindset of assume that you are speaking to these people face to face. They're all out there and you got to hit the level of energy appropriate for that size of a group. And that made it easier for me. Okay, Greg, I believe we go back to you now.
We don't.
Oh, no, we don't.
Are you throwing me under the bus?
I would, but I'm not going to. Because I have this thing marked in my script.
Don't throw your partner under the bus.
I have this time marker on my deck, my hard copy of my deck over here, and I assumed that meant, it goes to Greg. It doesn't.
Let's talk about that time marker. That's actually a really good point.
Oh, yeah.
When you are getting yourself prepared, especially in the virtual space, because as you all know, time functions differently. You have to know, where should I be at any particular point? And Dale, we are about 60 seconds behind. That's a good place to be, right? That's a super good place to be. But we also know where those trim points might be of the champagne that we could just skip over if it became a time management issue.
Right. And for me, I don't know about all of you, but the time pressure that you're under in this sort of environment is really a big one, because I tend to speak off the cuff. I'll go down a rabbit hole. I'll just let an example take over the whole presentation. And I've really got to stop myself from letting that happen so much when I'm speaking virtually, or whenever there is a strict, we're done in 30 minutes sort of situation. Okay, rather than talk more about that, let me go on to my next slide. Next agenda point here, we talk about framing the conversation. If we're going to assume that the work you're doing is a conversation, we have to think about how to get that conversation started. And that does involve how you introduce your session, but think of it as framing the conversation you want to have. So here's what we mean by that. You just saw this slide. A good solid frame will create the conditions for a fruitful discussion, earn trust and goodwill, make it easy for people. So you got to think about where they are and how you can bring them into the conversation you want to have. So when we talk about the frame, its purpose here, as you can see at the top, is to formalize the conversation. So this is your chance to say, okay, let's get started. Here's where we're going. The introduction sets up the body. The body is inside the frame, and the conclusion wraps things up at the end. So the body, the content that you're there to deliver, has to be set up in a way that the audience is brought into it, and that's what the frame's about. The frame in the introduction does these four things. It provides a sense of direction, purpose, context, and a reason to participate. So think carefully about how you can set things up in a way that will achieve all of these goals. And you always want to assume that they're distracted, even if they're not. When you do, you work harder to reach these four goals, because you think, when you assume, I have to fight a little bit, I have to really work to bring these people with me, your frame will be much, much stronger. And I will go into this example in spite of the fact that I'm 60 seconds behind, but I started life as a high school secondary teacher. I taught English to sophomores, and they didn't want to hear anything I had to say any day of the week. So they were relentless in their feedback to me, saying things like, I don't care, and why does this matter, and does this affect my grade? And by doing that, by being that specific, because a 15-year-old doesn't care, graduation's a long way off. So if they're 15 years old and you have to fight every day to give them a reason to do what you're asking them to do, you get really good at framing up that day's work. So I always find it helpful to think about those kids and what they did to teach me about framing, and always making clear what the goal and the benefit of the activity is. Okay, framing strategy, it involves four things. We are going to give you a handout about this, so don't worry about the details of it right now. But it involves four steps: audience's current situation, the goal of the session, and then down at the bottom, the agenda and the benefits to them. So let me talk to an example here. You'll see how this can work. This is about measurement and evaluation. So, as you all know, measurement and evaluation is an incredibly important part of our jobs, but it tends to be a little bit scary, and it's difficult to approach sometimes. So the purpose of this session today is to show you it's easier than you think. You really can effectively measure and evaluate the work that you do. The agenda looks like this. We're going to define what M&E is. We're going to talk about what data to collect, talk about partnering with the business, and then finally analyzing the data. So those are our four agenda points. At the end, we'll be able to better prove L&D's worth to our clients within the organization. So that's a frame for a presentation about M&E. It's short, it's brief, but it does focus on the takeaways and the process that you're going to take people through. Let's look at another one. This is a panel discussion. So let's say we're all looking for a job and we're thinking about becoming instructional designers, and we want to learn more about that field. So everybody's wondering if instructional design is right for you. That's everybody's current situation. So the benefits today is that you'll have a better understanding of ISD and your career options. The way we'll get there is to have a panel discussion. We're going to bring in 3 people who will share their insights into the field, and they will follow this agenda. One panelist will be introduced. The panelist introductions will occur. We'll have some prepared questions for them so that they can answer those, and then we'll go to your questions so that everybody gets the information that they're looking for. So there's another frame. I went in a different order, sort of an X-shaped order from a goal from a current situation to benefits. But any order that you take here works. Just find one that feels right to you, and you'll be able to frame up your session. Anything you want to add there, Greg, before I go on? All right. So the frame. is your promise of relevance and efficiency. Always focus on that. Always assume they want to know why they should care and that this is going to be an efficient use of their time. It really goes back to being a little, goes back to assuming that they are a little distracted. Same idea here. You want to make that promise at the beginning of your session. So here's the handout that you'll be getting. Take a look at it. It's our most popular download. Not that that matters to you, but it is. People find it a useful tool to have. And the thing to remember about it as you're looking at it is that step 2 of this, after you've identified the goal of your session, is to assess your audience. And of course, in your conference environment, it's kind of hard to assess your audience. But remember, if you don't know, ask them. It's a matter of taking the time at the beginning, as we did here, to find out just basic information. You know, are you an internal person? Are you an external person? That would matter if everybody was in one bucket or the other. I know when we do, back several years ago, we did big conference presentations, and what we did at the beginning was sort of take a poll. This was before all the electronic devices were around, but, you know, raise of hand. Would you like me to focus on A, B, or C? And then we take it from, you know, rearrange things and take a different dive into information based on their responses. So when you're crunched for time and you want to know what people need, ask them at the beginning and then be flexible enough to let that affect your delivery. One last thing about questions and answers. You want to frame an answer to a question. As you can see with these 2 images, there are really 2 approaches to take with Q&A. On the left, you can deliver the quick answer, then support it with information and evidence. On the right, you present all the information and the evidence and then say, so to answer your question. The one we recommend is the one on the left. It's harder to do, but take a pause long enough to think, all right, what's the short answer here? If it's a yes or no question, start with yes or no. You don't want to talk and talk and talk and talk and then finally get to, so to answer your question, the answer is yes. Because it just makes it more difficult for folks in your audience to pay attention and to listen to all that detail and wonder when you're going to get to the actual answer.
Speaking of Q&A and answering questions, I saw a question earlier about what do you do if, like it's dealing with the timing. Like how do you make sure that you have enough time? And then what if you're running ahead of schedule? Build in time for Q&A, because Q&A can last, you know, 1 minute or 15 minutes, depending on what's going on. So we usually say plan for about 50 minutes for a 60-minute session, and then you've got 10-minute buffer time.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to start talking about imagery and storytelling. So let me know.
Got it.
You know what? I'm not. I'm having a technical glitch, so let me try that again. Sharing my screen, share the window, and I think I did it right that time. Yes, I did. Okay, imagery and storytelling. Back in the day, Zen stones became all the rage. Now, I have nothing against Zen stones. Don't get me wrong there. They're lovely. But my point is, when you choose imagery for your slides, make sure that the metaphor makes sense to both you and the audience, because if your audience is working to figure out the metaphor, then their brain is somewhere else. So just be really specific and careful with the types of imagery that you choose. And that means avoid tired metaphors as well, right? We've all seen the thumbs up, the high fives. Steer clear of that tired stuff because it says something about your brand, right? Okay. And then, of course, when you have human beings in your presentation, try as best you can to choose diversity, images that show diversity. That is easier said than done, though, because of the limitations that's out there with stock photography. So I think that will probably change as the world continues to evolve and be more inclusive and diverse and equitable. But we're not there yet. Storytelling. Like or dislike, drop into chat whether you like telling stories or whether you dislike telling stories. And if you have a reason why, drop that into chat too. Love it. Yes. We've got to positives, most definitely, but to my detriment. Ooh, Rainey, I bet that means you tend to go off on a tangent, maybe. John says it's my strong point. Like, okay, very good. Jennifer says, I love them where appropriate. They really help get a point across. Love hearing them, but it's not easy to tell a compelling story. I agree. I like, but I dislike when people shoehorn in a story that feels out of place. Exactly. That is exactly my point. Thank you for making that. The stories need to be told with purpose. And they're super memorable, right? I'm sure you remember portions of the story that I told about the interview that I had with Training Magazine. So stories can be very powerful. They build your credibility without having to say I'm credible, because you're sharing your experiences and your emotions with people. Stories also reveal a little bit about who you are. You know that I'm judgmental because I walk out of presentations, right? That's a piece of who I am. And now you know that about me. So let's simplify business presentation or business stories. Stories describe events that happened or could happen at another time in another place. And business stories are always part of a larger conversation and are told with specific intent. That gets back to the comment of, stories that just sort of plop out of nowhere. Stories have to advance the narrative. They have to advance the story that you're telling in your conference presentations. So if you are the type of person who is wondering, how can I tell a compelling story? Oh, I'm going to go read a book on storytelling. Be very careful, because most of the resources that are out there are written by professional storytellers who talk about hero and villain and climax and all of that sort of stuff. And really, all you need to do is tell a story about a thing that happened, right? So be careful of overcomplicating storytelling. So the larger conversation, that's the equivalent of your conference presentation. You've got your introduction, your body, conclusion. Dale talked us through the frame or the introduction piece of it. And then the stories can be placed within. Anecdotes, analogies, hypotheticals. And keep in mind, too, that sometimes stories are planned and other times they're spontaneous, and that's okay. Just be careful of your time management, because as we've already established, managing time is very challenging, especially in the virtual space. So now let's get at virtual tools and interactivity. As the trainers that you are, the L&D pros that you are, we're going to assume that you already know how to use the virtual tools and when to use them. But we're going to give you a different way, a different lens of looking at them. So we'll take a look at a guy here. Depending on where you are from here, well, in the world, really, this might be called a teeter-totter or a seesaw, or in your language, who knows what it's called. But anyway, it's the playground equipment that you sit on one end and it does this. That's kind of what you are doing when you are facilitating any sort of interaction, right? You are sometimes exerting pressure on the control side to gain control back of a conversation that may have taken on a life of its own. And there are other times when you need to encourage that participation. So virtual tools can help you do this. Now, you want to be intentional, especially in the virtual space, with how and what type of interaction you're asking for. So you want to be intentional. We've added a bucket or a bowl of skills and techniques that our facilitator can lean into on one side or the other. So let's talk about virtual tools as a way to encourage participation. Well, we have done it many times today already, asking you to drop something into chat. We did a poll. All of those things, really, when it boils down, improves focus for them, because people are distracted, especially in the virtual space. So when you ask them to be active, it brings their attention back. At the same time, we have the same list of virtual tools that can help you control the room. So let's say that we were facilitating a discussion, all of our microphones were turned on, and the conversation is just going great. Well, at some point, you need to take control back. So one of the things you might do is say, hey, everybody, great conversation, but in terms of time management, we need to move on. So do me a favor, drop into chat the most important thing you want us to take away from this conversation. Give them 30 seconds or whatever to type, fix their typos, hit send, and then you have a record of that conversation and you're taking control back. So you can use these tools as time management. You may not have ever thought of them in that way before. You have to strike a balance, though. I'm sure you have been in situations where the instructor was asking you to be more interactive than you wanted to be, and it wasn't fruitful. I'm sure you've also attended sessions where there was no interaction whatsoever, and that then runs the risk of being boring. So you have to find the right balance of how much interactivity you have. That brings us to delivering slides virtually, and I'm going to let you take over from here, which means I need to stop sharing, and there we go.
Okay. Okay, forgive me, everyone. I did. Can you see that, Greg?
Yes, we can. Yep.
And of course, best practice is to have your slides queued up to exactly where you want them to be. I failed. So let me quickly go through Greg's. He just went through this.
Jennifer, remember we were saying in the backstage area that we will be plenty imperfect and we will show people how to deal with that?
I'm good at imperfect. I'm really good at that. So
it's always the way in technical and in virtual training. It's fabulous.
Yeah.
All right. I want to talk about delivering slides virtually. Now, I'm going to go fairly quickly through this, but I want to just give you the real basic fundamental stuff that will make life easier for you when you're delivering your slides. This focuses on making it easy for your audience to understand. It also helps for a good slide design, also helps you as the presenter. So when we were, back in before times when we were face-to-face, you directed focus to a slide by going to the screen and pointing to it. This woman is pointing to the orange half of that pie chart, and then you move away from the slide, physically move away from it, and talk to the folks about the point you want to make about that orange slice of the pie. Now, in virtual, life is different. You need to use directional and descriptive language. Examples including in the upper left corner of the slide, the blue box over there on the right, the red line on the graph shows this, and then moving on. Let's go to the next slide. You need to talk about where you want people to look and direct their attention as if you're pointing to it in a face-to-face environment. This is sometimes really tough to remember when you get caught up in the conversation yourself. It's natural for you to bring up a slide and start talking about the content of it rather than the fact that there is a new slide on the screen and people need to understand what they're seeing. But take the time to do that and it'll make life a lot easier for the people you're talking to. One way to do that is to use slide titles for both your benefit to help you and to help your listeners. Very simple example here. Here's a bar chart that goes from January through October, and it is a record of gross sales. Now, let's say that your presentation is not just about the fact that sales grew. You want to make a point about it. So the point you might want to make is that we've had month-over-month sales growth since last January. That slide title change helps get that point across. And you can also use, as you all know, you can use things like these call-out ovals or whatever to talk about a marketing initiative that happened between April and May. For me, as a presenter, this sort of title and this sort of layout of the slide helps me stay focused because, as I said, I tend to wander a bit. But it will also help your listeners a lot simply by being able to look at this and say, okay, this is about sales growth. So think about your slide titles. And the rule of thumb I always say is if you have a bunch of slides that all have exactly the same title coming one after another, take another look and see how you can adjust those titles to emphasize what that particular slide is about. It'll help your listeners a lot. Animation in virtual environments is much more important than it is face-to-face. In fact, when we're working face-to-face with people, most of the time what we're doing is saying, take out the animation. It's getting in your way or it's annoying. Virtually, use the animation. Build your bullets slowly. Bring in half of the slide and then the other half, as I just did with the woman presenting face-to-face. Movement helps. Make bullet points easy. So first of all, you know this, shorten them as much as you possibly can. Moving down there, explain their order, their importance, or their application. Keep them parallel. That middle one is important because sometimes it really helps people understand what you're saying when you say, what you're meaning rather, when you say things like, okay, these bullets go from most to least important. So let's look at them that way. The most important thing to think about is this, and then on and on and on. In terms of deliverability, keep your bullet points parallel. And what we mean by that is that they start with the same part of speech. The first word is the same part of speech for each bullet. The example here is shorten, explain, and keep, all verbs. It makes it much easier to read the bullet points when you do it that way. And Greg?
Sorry, there's a comment I just want to make. Somebody says about animations, just don't use the crazy animations. They make me seasick, right?
Yes.
Remember Prezi? It was so
yes.
swoopy doopy. Prezi, when was the last time you saw somebody use Prezi? Because it's annoying, right?
Oh, I got dizzy and kind of headachy watching a presentation. But you're absolutely right. I should have mentioned that. Thank you. Don't use the fancy ones. Appear works. Just choose appear out of all the options you have in PowerPoint. Choose appear. And I think another point I want to reemphasize here is that make these things easy for you to read. Because when you get into the presentation, we would encourage you to read your bullet points. If they're nice and clean and short, it's easy to do. If you haven't thought about that in advance, it'll be much more difficult. So we talked before about wanting to make sure that you were successful at the conference. I hope that we've given you some ideas to make that happen. As I said, there are some resources available to you. The 2 books are available. Greg, you want to talk about this slide?
Yeah, I'm just going to drop all of that stuff into chat for you right now.
Thank you.
There we go.
And the framing worksheet is much more not complicated. There's more to it than just the initial frame that I talked through today. So take a look at that. All right.
And that brings us to the end of our presentation, and time permitting, we can open it up to Q&A. And looking at us, we got ourselves back on track. We've got about 6 minutes or so to entertain a few more questions.
Yes, and one of the ones, Greg, I think you alluded to it earlier in the conversation, the Q&A. How do you plan your presentation so you have just enough or even slightly under the content for the time allotted? And I know you mentioned plan your session for, if it's a 60-minute, plan it for 50 minutes so that you've got time for Q&A. Any other fun tips and tricks you might add as well?
Yeah, I would just add, find your trim points. Trim points are slides that maybe you could take a deep dive into, or maybe it can be just a few seconds, or maybe you want to get rid of that slide. One of the things we've also done quite successfully is during the presentation, treat it as an advertisement for bonus material at the end. So one of our presentations has 4 pieces of bonus material, and depending on how much time we have left, tells us how many of those bonus pieces will go into, and we let the audience decide where is their interest level.
Nice.
Yep. And
I like that one.
Yep.
And it also has to do with knowing yourself well enough to know what your tendencies are. If you're the kind of person who wants to go through the information, then answer questions about it, you're very controlled, you're very organized, then you need to work on being more flexible in terms of your delivery. If you're like me and you tend to if you're more comfortable with the conversational side of it, you got to really force the structure on yourself. And for me, that means stop talking.
I'm with
reminding myself, I'm done, stop.
Yeah.
And if we're in the same room together, I can be in the back of the room going, right? Virtually, That's a little bit harder. We do communicate with each other via Slack on the back channel, which is a really important thing to be able to say, hey, you're behind schedule, or you just misgendered someone, clean that up, or something like that.
It's a matter of, we use the host or the producer, whatever term you use for that, because his name is Kevin, and Kevin will Slack us and say, you're 10 minutes behind. And I hate getting that kind of Slack in the moment. It's like, oh, but I know he's right. And so you got to pay attention to that and be flexible in how you respond.
Yeah. So I have a couple of other questions in the chat that are related to finishing up that conclusion piece, and how do you do it without seeming abrupt but not dragging it on?
I wish I had a really clear answer for that one. I think the conclusion is really hard because it's like, oh, we're done now. And you have to be careful of being too salesy too, right? Conference organizers do not like that. But you still want to be able to give people a chance to win a book, or to go download a book, or to buy a book, or what have you. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know, Greg, the last slide we added, or you added it this morning actually, was the slide 54, which has a repeat of the word success on it, which I used as a concluding slide. We saying, well, we were hoping to give you something to make you successful, but it's not always intuitive, as you can see. It was the last thing that went in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to say, I cannot say enough about this book. I'm going to do the shameless plug for you, because this book is so, they're not going to do it, but this book is so phenomenal, and you just experienced just the tip of the iceberg. And so the next time we're together, I'm bringing it, and y'all are going to sign it for me. Yeah.
Sure.
But it is definitely well worth a read. It's wonderful.
Thanks. And it might be worth talking about like how the book is structured. So you've never read a book that's been written like this, because we were told you can't do this, but we did anyway, which was we wrote the book based on a workshop that you might take with us, a presentation training. Dale is the lead instructor. I'm the coach. So Dale talks in the main room about all the theoretical stuff. And then we have 8 characters, fictional, but very, very real characters that we hope that you will latch on to 1 or 2 of those, because they have similar challenges to you. And then you, the reader, you actually sit on my shoulder as I'm coaching that person one-on-one after having delivered a portion of their presentation. So you really get a clear sense of what is Dale's voice and what is my voice.
And I believe y'all used different fonts, right?
Yeah,
Even
we did.
Different fonts for when Greg is speaking versus when Dale is speaking. It's really well done. Yeah.
Thanks. So a quick story. The editor took a first pass at it, and she hated the fact that we were using 2 separate voices, and she cut me out, and I was absolutely furious. And we were literally kicking and screaming, walking around our conference room table, and we had a meeting with the publisher in a couple of minutes to say, that's not okay. And I slammed out 4 stickies, mapped out the frame, and was able to frame up that conversation in a way that removed the emotion from it, which is a tricky thing to do, right, when you are super hyped up. And we actually, by the end of the day, we had a new editor who actually liked the fact that we had 2 separate voices.
Yeah, don't cut Greg out of the book.
Oh, no.
No.
You're not going to want to do that.
Yeah.
That's when the horns come out, right?
So, Liz, did I miss any questions?
Oh, no, we still can't hear you.
Oh, no. All right.
I think we're done now, is what she's saying, right? Thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate that you spent an hour with us. We really, really do. Best of luck. You're going to be great. Continue to grow your career. Speaking at conferences is a great way to do that.
Yeah, good job, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here, and for Greg and Dale, for you to come in.